It is the 9th of April, 1483. Edward IV, Yorkist king and victor in the Wars of the Roses, is dead. He leaves the throne of England to his young son Edward, whilst his second, Richard, is given the title Duke of York. But in a turn of fate, the two boys are declared illegitimate by their uncle and protector, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who seizes the throne for himself, and shortly afterwards, both children go missing after being imprisoned in the Tower of London. Distraught at their demise, the boy's mother blames the newly crowned Richard III for her son's disappearance, assuming them murdered and vowing vengeance. She soon begins plotting with the last remaining Lancastrians to seize the crown and bring down her son's murderer. Her name? Elizabeth Woodville, the White Queen. The woman known to history as Elizabeth Woodville was born during October of 1437 in Northamptonshire, in the small village of Grafton Regis, previously known as Grafton Woodville, in a manor house called Woodville Manor, which previously belonged to the local Norman monastery. Her father was Sir Richard Woodville, 1st Earl Rivers, the son of Joan Bittlesgate and Richard Woodville, who was chamberlain to the Duke of Bedford. Sir Richard was a member of the landed gentry. He was from a wealthy family, which included commissioners of the peace, sheriffs, and MPs, and he would, like his father, work in the household of the Duke of Bedford. Elizabeth's mother was Jacquetta of Luxembourg, the eldest daughter of Peter I of Luxembourg and his wife Margaret of Beau, Count and Countess of Saint-Pol, Conversano, and Brienne. Jacquetta had been married before she married Elizabeth's father. In fact, she had married the Duke of Bedford in 1433 at the age of 17, when Sir Richard was part of the Bedford's household, and as such she was a firm ally of the House of Lancaster. However, that would all change when she married Sir Richard, as together they would be allied closely to the House of York. When the Duke of Bedford died in 1435, it came as no surprise. He had been much older than his young bride and also in ill health, and his passing left his second wife Jacquetta, a wealthy widow with no children from the marriage. Her second marriage to Sir Richard, however, would cause a scandal at court, as the two were of very different social standing, Jacquetta being the daughter of a noble, whilst Sir Richard was only a member of the gentry, and so was considered an unsuitable match for her. In fact, Jacquetta was fined £1,000 for disobeying the terms of her dowry and marrying without the consent of the king. She sold some of her West Country manors in order to pay the fine. Despite this scandalous start to their marriage, they would become known as the handsomest couple in England, and Jacquetta would go on to bear Richard Woodville 14 children. Their life together was one centred around family. They were also prosperous, thanks mainly to Jacquetta's links with the royal family as the Duchess of Bedford. Richard Woodville was given various military positions and was considered a distinguished soldier and a knight of considerable valour. When King Henry VI of England married Margaret of Anjou on the 23rd of April 1445, the Woodville family were amongst those chosen to accompany Margaret on her journey to England. This was because there were family ties between the bride and Jacquetta, as her sister Isabel was married to Margaret's uncle Charles Dumaine. Further honours arrived in 1448, when Sir Richard was made Baron Rivers, making their life and that of their children one of comfort and privilege. Elizabeth would spend her early years in the company of her brothers and sisters in the nursery at Grafton, where she would have been cared for and educated by servants, nurses, and either a master or mistress who would have provided their early education. The siblings would not have spent a great deal of time with their parents, who were frequently absent from home, but despite this, Elizabeth is thought to have had a good relationship with her parents and to have been a bright and intelligent child. When she was 7 years old, Elizabeth Woodville was sent away to be educated at another household, that of Sir Edward Grey and his wife Elizabeth Lady Ferrers, 6th Baroness Ferrers of Groby, a custom of the time, which enabled young children of nobles to make social contacts with other noble families. Whilst she was there, Elizabeth studied Latin, French and English, being taught to read and write in all 3 languages. She also studied law and mathematics, and would have also been able to visit home periodically, as the Grey seat at Groby in Leicestershire was not too far from Grafton Manor. Whilst growing up, Elizabeth was considered to have a good figure and be somewhat of a beauty, with long blonde hair, fair skin, a fetching smile and a high forehead. She had, quote, heavy-lidded eyes like those of a dragon, the most beautiful woman in the island of Britain. And so it was that in 1452, at the age of 14, Elizabeth's allure resulted in her marriage to Sir John Grey of Groby, the 20-year-old son of her tutor, Lady Elizabeth Ferrers. Elizabeth would go on to have 2 sons with Sir John. The firstborn was Thomas, who was born in 1455, who later became the Marquis of Dorset, and 2 years later, in 1457, Richard was born, and it was Richard who would later be executed on the orders of Richard III in June 1483 at the age of 26. Sir John Grey supported the Lancastrian cause during the Wars of the Roses, which was a bloody struggle for the throne of England between the descendants of King Edward III of the Plantagenet dynasty. The House of Lancaster, whose symbol was a red rose, was led by King Henry VI, a descendant of John of Gaunt, the 3rd surviving son of King Edward III, and the House of York, whose token was the white rose, was led by Richard, Duke of York, who was descended from Edmund of Langley, the 4th surviving son of Edward III. At this time, when Elizabeth was a teenaged girl, the position of Henry VI as king was tenuous, and it was further compounded when he suffered his first mental breakdown in 1453, possibly as a result of his army's final defeat against the French in the 100 Years' War, resulting a year later in Richard III's father, Richard Duke of York, being made protector of the realm whilst the king was recovering. The Wars of the Roses began when Elizabeth Woodville was 18. They started when the Duke of York, who greatly resented the power wielded by a few aristocratic favourites of Henry VI, attempted to remove Henry's followers from power, and were fuelled further by social and financial difficulties following the 100 Years' War. Various battles took place between 1455 and 1487, with other related skirmishes taking place outside of this time frame, but the eventual outcome was that the male line of both families were eliminated. The Duke of York was the grandson of Edmund of Langley, the 1st Duke of York, whilst his mother Anne Mortimer was herself the great-granddaughter of Edward III's second son, the Duke of Clarence, as her grandfather, Edmund Mortimer, 3rd Earl of March, had married Clarence's only daughter Philippa. The power and influence of the Duke of York increased when he inherited the Duke of Clarence's claim to the throne through his mother Anne, as her brother Edmund Mortimer, 5th Earl of March, died with no heirs in 1425. This effectively made him one of the country's richest landowners. This maternal lineage formed the backbone of Richard, Duke of York's claim to the English throne, and is one of the main reasons for the Wars of the Roses, as although he was a descendant of the 4th son of King Edward III, he was now also the heir of Edward's 2nd son, Lionel of Antwerp, the Duke of Clarence, who had technically been the next in line to the throne after the death of Richard II. York sought to capitalise on Henry VI's weakness by demanding he be recognised as the rightful heir to the throne, but he inevitably faced opposition from the king's Lancastrian supporters, most notably his wife, Queen Margaret of Anjou, who wanted her infant son with Henry, Edward of Westminster, to succeed him as king. Outraged by York's actions, Margaret formed a powerful coalition against him, and with the support of other Lancastrian nobles, such as the Duke of Somerset, she pressured the king to remove York from his role as protector of the realm. Henry VI then recovered from his illness in December of 1454 and relieved York of his position, after which Richard gathered his supporters and marched on London, in the hope of confronting Henry's Lancastrian advisors. The two sides met on the 22nd of May 1455 in what is regarded as the opening confrontation of the Wars of the Roses, the First Battle of St Albans, in which the Yorkist side defeated the Lancastrians. The Duke of Somerset was killed, and Henry VI was taken prisoner. However, in 1459 fortunes were to favour the Lancastrians, when fighting resumed more violently than ever, and the Duke of York and his followers fled the country, after which Henry was briefly returned to power, until York's ally, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, also known as the Kingmaker, invaded England from Calais on the 26th of June 1460, and Henry VI was captured yet again at the Battle of Northampton on the 10th of July. Richard returned to England and took the title of Protector of England, but he was persuaded not to take the crown, but instead, with the Act of Accord, it was agreed that Henry VI would retain the crown, but the descendants of Richard, Duke of York, would succeed Henry, bypassing Henry's own son, Edward of Westminster. Henry had no choice but to agree to the act, but instead of prompting peace, it provoked even more discontentment, as Edward's mother, Margaret of Anjou, would not accept the disinheritance of her son, and so she gathered together her Lancastrian supporters in the north, and Richard began his march north to engage their forces. However, both Richard and his second son, Edmund, died at the Battle of Wakefield in December of 1460. Their bodies were decapitated by the Lancastrians, and their heads were impaled on spikes, which were placed on the Micklegate Bar gatehouse of the city of York. On the 2nd of February 1461, Edward, Earl of March, won a hard-fought victory against the Lancastrians at Mortimer's Cross. The battle was preceded by a parhelion, or three suns rising, a meteorological phenomenon, which he would take as his emblem, the sun in splendour. However, the joy of the victory was short-lived, due to Warwick's defeat at the Second Battle of St Albans on the 17th of February 1461, where the Lancastrians regained custody of Henry VI, after having lost him to the Yorkists the previous year, in July 1460, at Northampton. As a knight, Elizabeth Woodville's husband, Sir John Grey, fought for the House of Lancaster at the Second Battle of St Albans on the 17th of February 1461, which took place at St Albans in Hertfordshire. The Yorkist army under the Earl of Warwick attempted to block the road to London to the north of the town, but the Lancastrian army outflanked Warwick's forces to take him by surprise, cut off any escape route to London, and drive his army from the field. At dusk, the Earl of Warwick, realising his forces were outnumbered, withdrew. King Henry VI was released, and was famously said to have spent the battle singing under a tree. Although it had been a victory for the Lancastrians, Sir John Grey died in battle, leaving Elizabeth Woodville a widow at the age of 23, and having previously been married to a Lancastrian knight. It was ironic that Elizabeth's future husband would be Edward IV, who held the Yorkist claim to the throne, and who was a central figure during the Wars of the Roses, reigning as King of England from the 4th of March 1461 to the 3rd of October 1470, and then again from the 11th of April 1471 until he died on the 9th of April 1483. When the Duke of York died in December 1460 at the Battle of Wakefield, his son Edward, Earl of March, inherited the Yorkist claim to the throne. Taking up his father's mantle, he defeated the Lancastrians at Mortimer's Cross and Towton in early 1461, and deposed King Henry VI, the boy king, who had gained the crown at the age of only 9 months on the death of his father. He also became King of France on the death of his maternal grandfather Charles VI, the only English monarch to have also succeeded to the French throne as Henry II in 1431. Contemporaries described Edward as handsome, agreeable and energetic, and also unusually tall for the time, being 6'4" in height. He must have been an impressive sight dressed in full armour. He also made sure that his clothes were splendid, in complete contrast to Henry, whose physical and mental frailties must have made him a pathetic figure in the eyes of the court. Edward, Earl of March, was hastily proclaimed King Edward IV in London, the first ever Yorkist king, on the 4th of March 1461, before marching north to meet the remaining Lancastrian forces at the Battle of Towton, which was fought on Palm Sunday, the 29th of March. The weather was deplorable for the battle. A snowstorm blew up and heralded the most bloody battle ever in England. It ended in victory for the Yorks, but only after a count of between 9,000 and 20,000 dead according to various estimates, as well as the loss of many Lancastrian nobility, which meant that resentment for their losses were held enduringly by the surviving Lancastrians, who continued to fight in the north until 1464. It is unclear when or how Edward actually met Elizabeth Woodville, and they may have even known each other as children. However, it has been suggested that they may have first become interested in each other in France, when Elizabeth's parents were serving in Rouen while Edward's father was resident there in his position as Lieutenant of Normandy. Throughout much of Edward's youth, Elizabeth would have been unavailable, as she was married, but this situation would change shortly after Edward became king. It is therefore possible that he previously admired her from afar, but once they met, their attraction was definitely established. The Woodvilles were put in a difficult position following Edward's victory at Towton in 1461, as Elizabeth's family had fought on the Lancastrian side and survived, and yet Edward stayed at their home at Groby in Leicestershire in June 1461, and even gave a pardon to Elizabeth's father, which marked the start of a new relationship between the family and the Yorkist faction. And as the newly widowed Elizabeth was probably staying at her parents' home, this could be seen as a decisive moment in their relationship. Elizabeth's first recorded contact with Edward's court happened on the 13th of April 1464, when she was 26, only a few months before their marriage, when Elizabeth appealed to William Lord Hastings, overseer of the Yorkist Midlands, to ask for his help concerning a dispute which had arisen with her mother-in-law, and some sources suggest that Elizabeth was waiting with her children under an oak tree in Whittlebury Forest, a helpless widow, hoping to make a plea for the inheritance of her sons, when Edward came riding by, and heard her problems, promptly falling in love with her. But accounts of Elizabeth's guile might also suggest that it was no happy accident. Indeed, rumours at the time suggested that Elizabeth practised magic and cast a spell on Edward to make him fall in love with her. The story went that a water goddess named Melusina married one of Elizabeth's ancestors, Count Siegfried, and that all their female descendants were possessed of magic powers. Such rumours were likely spread to discredit the Woodvilles, who were unpopular with the nobles due to their low social standing, with Elizabeth seen as a poor match for the king. Edward was known to be a philanderer at the time and had many mistresses as well as illegitimate children during his life, but despite this, it is said that he fell in love with the widowed Elizabeth, who resisted his approaches at first and held out for marriage before allowing him into her bed. And because of the contentiousness the marriage would provoke, their wedding took place in secret, on the 1st of May 1464, about 3 years into Edward's reign, although the date is not certain. The wedding took place in her family's home in Grafton Regis, Northamptonshire, in a small chapel called the Hermitage, hidden in the woods, the bride attended by her ladies-in-waiting and her mother. The king consummated the marriage after the ceremony, but was called away to Stony Stratford for military reasons. But he returned that night, and his new wife was brought to his bedchamber once again by her mother, and thereafter he stayed for 4 days receiving the hospitality of his new in-laws until the 4th of May, when Edward left to meet up with his forces at Leicester, and it wasn't until a year after the marriage that Elizabeth Woodville was crowned queen on the 26th of May 1465, amidst lavish celebrations in Westminster Abbey, the Sunday after Ascension Day, the first time a commoner had married a king since before 1066. When Edward IV came to the throne, most of the nobility had either stayed loyal to Henry or remained neutral, forcing Edward to rely heavily on the Nevilles, and so gaining support at court would be a major consideration for Edward. However, John Neville's victory at the Battle of Hexham in 1464, just 2 weeks after Edward's secret marriage to Elizabeth, seemed to end the remaining Lancastrian military threat at least. The Battle of Hexham, fought on the 15th of May 1464, was to mark the end of any significant Lancastrian resistance in the north of England. The battle was fought near Hexham in Northumberland, with John Neville leading a small force of 3,000 to 4,000 men for the Yorkists. They routed the Lancastrians, and while most of the rebel leaders were captured and executed, such as Henry Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and Lord Hungerford, Henry VI was kept at a safe distance, as he had been captured in battle 3 times before. He was able to subsequently escape to the north, reportedly riding the fastest of any man on the day to ensure his safety, and remained a fugitive from Edward for over a year. Meanwhile, at court, divisions were arising amongst the nobility, caused by both differences over policy and anger over the exorbitant taxation required to recoup the cost of the Lancastrian War, as well as by Warwick's claim that he was the most senior member of King Edward IV's court. This caused internal argument and feuding. During this time, despite being already married, Edward allowed Warwick to continue negotiating a treaty with Louis XI of France, which included a proposed marriage between Edward and either Anne of France, the daughter of the French king, or Bona of Savoy, King Louis's sister-in-law, even though Edward preferred Burgundy as an ally, not least because of the trade England profited from. However, Warwick held the vested interest of a promised personal European duchy from Louis should the match be successfully made. And so when Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville became public knowledge, with Edward announcing it at a council meeting of nobles and clerics in Reading, Warwick was angry, embarrassed as well as offended. Not only was this woman a commoner, but she was also a widow with 2 sons. She was 4 years the king's senior, and she was from a family of Lancastrian supporters. And so his relationship with Edward IV dwindled beyond recovery. In addition, the marriage was badly received by Edward's family, his household, and the Privy Council, which was a body of advisers to the king, who, according to Jean de Rohan, told Edward that, quote, he must know that she was no wife for a prince such as himself. Edward's choice of a bride was seen as unwise. Not only had he chanced political unrest at court, he was also thought to have wasted the chance of a useful, politically expedient foreign marriage. But although his choice was seen as unusual, it was not without precedent, as Henry VI's mother, Catherine of Valois, had married her chamberlain Owen Tudor, whilst Edward IV's grandson, Henry VIII, would later make himself head of the church in order to marry his second wife, Anne Boleyn. And like Anne Boleyn, chroniclers recall that Elizabeth may have also used her wiles to capture her king, not succumbing to his advances without first being married. But by all accounts, Elizabeth also possessed considerable charm, physical beauty, and intelligence, whilst Edward was used to getting what he wanted, and in this instance, he wanted Elizabeth. While most historians agree that the marriage was an impulsive decision to marry for love on the part of Edward, others suggest that there may have been a political motive to the decision also. This was because, unlike the powerful Nevilles, the Woodvilles, with their low social status, would have been entirely reliant on Edward, and so more likely to remain loyal to him. Others argue that better options were open to him should this have been his true motive. The marriage would, however, have the advantage of making the king appear even-handed, as well as his own man, as he made the decision independently of Warwick. But whatever the motive, all opinions agree with the contention that the marriage caused disunity amongst the Yorkists, alienating Warwick in particular, but also having political implications which affected the rest of Edward's reign. The new queen started making her mark on the court from very early on, with regal ceremony whenever she appeared in public, insisting that even her brother Anthony should kneel before addressing her. As well as this, 4 of her sisters married the sons of the Earls of Kent, Essex, Pembroke and Arundel, while another sister, Catherine Woodville, married the Queen's 11-year-old ward Henry Stafford, 2nd Duke of Buckingham, against his wishes. Elizabeth was given an allowance of 4,000 marks for the running of her household, which was reportedly well administered, and she was also given the Palace of Greenwich and a house in London, near Smithfield. As well as this, Edward ordered that the arms of Queen's College, Cambridge, be replaced with those of his wife in 1465. Elizabeth used her charm on Edward to secure favours and position for many of her family and friends, which further angered some of the older noble families, who saw the Woodvilles as unwelcome newcomers, upstarts and commoners at that, who were attempting to take over the running of the court, as well as gaining too great an influence over Edward. In the meantime, Henry VI had been captured in July of 1465 and brought to London lashed to a small horse. He was abused by the crowd and imprisoned in the Tower. He was given wine, the services of a chaplain, and also allowed visitors, one of whom tried to kill Henry. He forgave the attacker and generally bore his confinement with strength and patience. Edward's decision to treat Henry well may have been an attempt to strengthen the view of him as an even-handed and reasonable king. In January of the following year, Edward and Elizabeth attended a solemn ceremony at Fotheringay for the reinterment of the bodies of the Duke of York and the Earl of Rutland. Elizabeth was heavily pregnant by this time, and on the 11th of February 1466, she gave birth to their first child, a girl they called Elizabeth. Edward had been told by the attending doctor that the baby would be a boy, but the doctor made a swift departure before the king had been told that the baby was actually a girl. Edward marked the birth of his daughter by giving Elizabeth a jewel-encrusted ornament which cost £125. She was later churched in a grand ceremony in Westminster Abbey, attended by her mother, 2 dukes and 60 attendants, followed by a grand feast which Elizabeth hosted from a golden chair. Warwick was made godfather, and the baby's grandmothers, the Duchesses of Bedford and York, were made her godmothers. The baby girl was the first princess born to a reigning Queen of England for over 100 years. Also at this time, another marriage shocked the court, which was that of Catherine, Duchess of Norfolk, a 3 times widowed woman of 67, who married Elizabeth's brother John, who was 20 at the time, which created much gossip and scandal at court for such a young man in his prime to marry a woman of her age. As well as this, Thomas Grey, Elizabeth's son from her first marriage, married the first of 2 wealthy heiresses he would eventually marry. Firstly, Lady Anne Holland in 1466, who died without issue, and then Cecily Bonville, the 7th Baroness Harrington in 1474, whose family had been loyal supporters of the House of York during the dynastic civil wars. As well as this, Elizabeth's father was made Earl Rivers and Treasurer of England in the spring of 1466, replacing Warwick's uncle, Lord Mountjoy. The rising confidence of the Woodville family continued to cause much conflict at court. Elizabeth Woodville's brother, Anthony Woodville, 2nd Earl Rivers, who was a talented jouster, bibliophile and writer, most famous for his English translation of The Dictates and Sayings of the Philosophers, one of the earliest books printed in England by William Caxton, brazenly began to challenge Warwick's position at court and in political spheres. As well as this, the Woodvilles supported Edward's wish for a Burgundian alliance rather than an alliance with Louis, which was favoured by Warwick. Frustrated by this opposition, Warwick conspired with his son-in-law, George, Duke of Clarence, arranging for one of his followers to accuse Elizabeth Woodville's mother, Jacquetta of Luxembourg, of practising witchcraft. But despite the accusation, she was acquitted 1 year later. The Woodvilles' interference in Warwick's foreign policy continued, as did their opposition to the wider Neville family. This culminated in Edward dismissing Warwick's brother George Neville, Archbishop of York, as his Lord Chancellor in 1467. Warwick had decided to ally himself with Edward's disaffected younger brother and heir, the Duke of Clarence, who held estates next to the Neville lands in the north. Concerned by this, Edward blocked the proposed marriage between Clarence and Warwick's eldest daughter, Isabel, which George Neville had asked the Pope's dispensation for, without Edward's knowledge. Nevertheless, in early July, Clarence travelled to Calais, where he married Isabel in a ceremony conducted by George Neville, which was overseen by Warwick, and the three men issued a remonstrance, which was a list of alleged abuses carried out by the Woodvilles and other advisers close to Edward, and on their return to London, they assembled an army to remove the king and his councillors and establish a government. At the Battle of Edgecote on the 24th of July 1469, the royal army was defeated by the Nevilles, while Edward was still in the north, and after the battle, Edward was held in Middleham Castle, while his father-in-law, Richard Woodville, and Richard's younger son, John Woodville, were executed at Kenilworth on the 12th of August. However, it soon became apparent that there was little support for Warwick or Clarence in the country, and so Edward was released in September of 1469 and resumed the throne. However, tensions remained. The Percys traditionally fought against the Neville family in the north, fighting for the House of Lancaster at Towton, where they suffered a defeat which resulted in their titles and estates being removed and given to Warwick's brother, John Neville, instead. And in early 1470, Edward reinstated Henry Percy as Earl of Northumberland, while John Neville was only compensated with the title Marquess of Montague. This was seen as a demotion for a key supporter, and so with this action, Edward only increased the Nevilles' sense of vulnerability and displacement. Warwick and Clarence initiated a full-scale revolt in March 1470, which was swiftly put down, after which the two fled to France in May, where Louis XI persuaded Warwick to seek the aid of his one-time enemy, Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI, who eventually agreed. And so, with French support, Warwick landed in England on the 9th of September 1470 and announced his intention to restore Henry. By this point, the Yorkist regime was deeply unpopular, and so the Lancastrians were able to rapidly assemble an army of over 30,000 men. And when John Neville switched sides, Edward was forced to flee the country to Bruges, where he spent his exile. Edward spent his exile in Flanders, in the Duchy of Burgundy. He was accompanied by Anthony Woodville, William Hastings, and his younger brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as well as a contingent of a few hundred men. However, although the ruler of the duchy, Charles the Bold, was married to Edward's sister Margaret, Edward received little aid from him, something he would never forget. Meanwhile, back in England, following her husband's temporary fall from power, Elizabeth Woodville sought sanctuary in Westminster Abbey, giving birth there to a son, Edward, who would later become King Edward V of England. Henry's return to power lasted less than 6 months, as the issues which affected his first reign arose again, his mental and physical frailties, making him unable to rule effectively, and so Warwick and Clarence effectively ruled the restored Lancastrian regime in his name, which resulted in a power struggle that was exacerbated by internal wrangling between bitter enemies in the Lancastrian coalition. For example, Edmund Beaufort, 4th Duke of Somerset, a cousin of both Henry VI and Richard, Duke of York, blamed Warwick for his father's death in 1455, and he had also executed his elder brother in 1464, and so Warwick and Clarence quickly found themselves isolated at court. Henry VI had made Clarence next in line to the throne after Henry's son, Edward of Westminster, but Warwick's actions made Clarence realise that he was unlikely to ever attain the throne if his father-in-law had his way, as Warwick had married his younger daughter Anne Neville to Henry VI's son Edward of Westminster in December 1470, and so on hearing of this, the Duke of Clarence was secretly reconciled with Edward IV. Edward finally had the help he needed to win back his throne, and so, backed by wealthy Flemish merchants, in March 1471, Edward invaded England, landing near Hull, close to his estates in Yorkshire. And while his supporters were initially reluctant to commit, the key northern city of York did open its gates, but only when he claimed to be seeking the return of his dukedom. The first significant group to join was a contingent commanded by Sir James Harrington and Sir William Parr, made up of 600 men. And whilst Parr had originally fought against the Yorkists at Edgecote in 1469, he also decided to defect, and like Clarence, made the decision to switch sides. And while marching south, more recruits joined them, including 3,000 men from Leicester. Edward arrived in London unopposed. He entered the city and took Henry prisoner. Meanwhile, Warwick was defeated and killed on the 14th of April 1471 at the Battle of Barnet, while a second Lancastrian army was defeated at the Battle of Tewkesbury on the 4th of May 1471, the Yorkists' final decisive battle, where 16-year-old Edward of Westminster, the Lancastrian heir to the throne, died fighting on the battlefield, and the surviving leaders like Somerset were executed shortly afterwards. On the 21st of May 1471, King Henry VI died in the Tower of London, if not at the hands of Richard of Gloucester, then by his order, according to several accounts. However, the most contemporary account states that Gloucester was there, along with many others, and the murder was almost certainly carried out on the orders of Edward IV. But it was announced that he had died, quote, of pure displeasure and melancholy, because of the loss of his son at Tewkesbury. But few believed this version of events. And despite the continued presence of Henry Tudor, the last Lancastrian with any claim to the throne, Edward reigned in relative peace for the following 12 years. John de Vere, 13th Earl of Oxford, surrendered in March 1474. His was the last significant rebellion, although he did survive to command the Lancastrian army at Bosworth in 1485, in which Clarence was suspected of involvement, a factor that led to the Duke's eventual death in the Tower of London on the 18th of February 1478, which was followed by claims he had, quote, drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, which was supposed to have been a joke made by Edward, referring to Clarence's favourite drink. In early 1483, Edward's health began to fail. He was suffering from various ailments, which his physicians attributed in part to his use of emetics, which allowed him to overeat at meals and then vomit to allow enough room in his stomach to start eating again. And so, by Easter of 1483, Edward fell fatally ill, but survived long enough to add codicils to his will, the most important stating that his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, should be protector after his death. He died on the 9th of April 1483 and was interred in St George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. After the death of Edward IV, the Dowager Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, remained politically influential and appointed family members to key positions, also arranging the coronation of her 12-year-old son Edward V as king, circumventing Edward's brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, whom the late king had appointed Lord Protector. However, there was disagreement within the House of York over whether the boy was old enough to govern in his own name. Queen Elizabeth believed so, and the former King's Council agreed that Edward should be crowned without delay. The boy's uncle, King Edward IV's younger brother Richard, evidently saw it differently, and former Lord Chamberlain and close friend of Edward IV, William Hastings, who was an enemy of the Woodvilles but had long been friendly with Richard, was a key figure in reporting what was happening to him. Elizabeth's brother, Anthony Woodville, 2nd Earl Rivers, brought Edward, the Prince of Wales, straight back to London under an armed guard under the instructions of his sister. But Hastings informed Richard of their whereabouts and asked him to make his way to London. And so they were intercepted by Richard, who arrested the Earl along with his nephew, Sir Richard Grey, the young king's half-brother. After this, Hastings supported Richard's formal installation as Lord Protector and collaborated with him in the Royal Council. On the 30th of April, Elizabeth heard the news of her brother's arrest. The Dowager Queen took sanctuary in Westminster Abbey and was joined there by her son by her first marriage, Thomas Grey, 1st Marquis of Dorset, as well as her 5 daughters, and her youngest son, Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York. On the 10th or 11th of June, Richard wrote to Ralph, Lord Neville, and others asking for their support against, quote, the Queen, her blood adherents and affinity, whom he suspected of plotting his murder. And then on the 13th of June 1483, affairs were to take a dramatic change during a council meeting at the Tower of London, when Richard, supported by the Duke of Buckingham, accused 2 council members as well as Hastings of committing treason by conspiring with the Woodvilles to kill him. Hastings' mistress, Jane Shore, who was formerly also mistress to Edward IV and Thomas Grey amongst others, acted as a go-between, and while the other alleged conspirators were imprisoned, Hastings was beheaded. Meanwhile, on the 16th of June, the Dowager Queen agreed to hand over her younger son, Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, to the Archbishop of Canterbury, so that he might attend his brother Edward's coronation, which was still planned for the 22nd of June. However, on the 25th of June, 1483, Gloucester had Elizabeth Woodville's son by Sir John Grey, Richard Grey, and her brother Anthony Woodville, 2nd Earl Rivers, executed in Pontefract Castle, Yorkshire, sweeping away more remaining obstacles to his kingship. Edward V and his 9-year-old younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, were installed in the Tower of London by Richard, supposedly to prepare for Edward's forthcoming coronation as king. However, before the young king could be crowned, the Titulus Regius was issued, which declared Edward and his brother illegitimate by Act of Parliament. The Act declared Edward IV's children with Elizabeth illegitimate on the grounds that Edward IV had a pre-existing contract with a widow, Lady Eleanor Butler, which was a legally binding contract that rendered any other marriage contract invalid. One contemporary source, the Burgundian chronicler Philippe de Comines, stated that Robert Stillington, the Bishop of Bath and Wells, carried out the engagement ceremony between Edward IV and Lady Eleanor, and so after this announcement, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Edward's brother and Lord Protector, seized the throne and became King Richard III. There was a final sighting of the 2 brothers in the Tower during the summer of 1483, but it is unclear what happened to the boys after this last recorded sighting of them. It is generally assumed that they were murdered by Richard to secure his hold on the throne. And while their deaths may have occurred sometime during 1483, apart from their disappearance, the only evidence against Richard is circumstantial, and as a result, several other theories about their fates have been proposed, including that they were murdered by Henry Stafford, 2nd Duke of Buckingham, or Henry VII, amongst others. Elizabeth was heartbroken when she heard the rumours of the demise of her sons, and reportedly fell to the ground, pulling out her hair and beating her breast, no doubt blaming herself for letting her younger son be taken out of the safety of their sanctuary. This, after the loss of her elder son, Richard Grey, as well as her brother at Pontefract, must have been too much to bear, and her health suffered following the news. The physician who attended her was a Dr. Lewis, who was also physician to Margaret Beaufort, and it was he who first suggested the idea of a marriage union between the families. Elizabeth, who was now known as Dame Elizabeth Grey, both grief-stricken and furious, allied herself with Lady Margaret Beaufort as well as Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, the husband of her sister, Catherine Woodville, who had originally supported Richard's claim, although his motivation for agreeing to the alliance may have been out of his own self-interest, to secure closer ties to the potential new king, or to even claim the throne for himself, as he was descended from Edward III through John of Gaunt, and also Thomas of Woodstock, the 1st Duke of Gloucester, on his father's side, as well as through the line of John Beaufort, the son of John of Gaunt, on his mother's side. Together, the 3 gathered support for the claim to the throne of Margaret's son, Henry Tudor, a great-great-great-grandson of King Edward III, who was the closest Lancastrian male heir with a claim to the throne with any true validity, and to strengthen his claim, they conspired to arrange a marriage for Henry to the daughter of Elizabeth Woodville and Edward IV, Elizabeth of York, who would become the heiress of the House of York upon the death of her brothers. Such a marriage would finally unite the 2 feuding houses of York and Lancaster. Henry Tudor agreed to the plan, and on Christmas Day, 25th of December 1483, he swore an oath to that effect in public in the cathedral at Rennes, France. Although in January 1484, Richard III's first parliament stripped Elizabeth of all the lands given to her during Edward IV's reign. On the 1st of March 1484, Elizabeth and her daughters came out of their self-imposed sanctuary after Richard III publicly swore an oath that her daughters would not be harmed and that they would not be sent to the Tower of London or kept in any other prison. He also made a promise to give them marriage dowries and to marry them to, quote, gentlemen born. The family returned to court, apparently reconciled to Richard III, and after the death in March 1485 of Anne Neville, Richard III's wife, there were even rumours that the widowed king was going to marry his young niece, the beautiful Elizabeth of York. During his reign, there were two major rebellions against Richard. In October of 1483, an unsuccessful revolt was led by Henry Stafford after he became disaffected with Richard. Buckingham's rebellion, as it became known, was a failed but significant uprising in England and parts of Wales, which had the backing of the exiled Henry Tudor and his mother, Margaret Beaufort. The rebels took up arms against King Richard, and with supplies and money borrowed from Francis II, Duke of Brittany, his host, Henry attempted to land in England. 7 ships from Brittany, carrying over 500 Breton soldiers, along with Henry Tudor and many of his supporters, were to have risen simultaneously against Richard III. However, a gale prevented the planned landing, and then a premature uprising in Kent forewarned Richard that Buckingham had changed sides, and so following the rebellion, with his conspiracy uncovered, Richard arranged for the execution of the primary co-conspirator, Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, for treason on the 2nd of November 1483, and he was beheaded in the courtyard between the Saracen's Head Inn and the Blue Boar Inn in the marketplace in Salisbury. The sister of Elizabeth Woodville, Catherine, was thus made a widow with the death of Buckingham. They had been married since they were both children, and a contemporary source relates that at the coronation of Elizabeth Woodville on the 26th of May 1465, the two had been carried on squires' shoulders because of their youth, as Henry Stafford was 9 and Catherine was just 7. But only 2 years after the death of Stafford on the 7th of November 1485, Catherine married Jasper Tudor, the uncle of Henry Tudor. Whilst in exile in Brittany in 1485, Henry Tudor initially enjoyed the support of the Breton treasurer Pierre Landais. However, Richard persuaded him to turn Henry over along with Jasper Tudor and the other exiled Lancastrians, promising him military support for his campaign against the rebel Breton nobility, whereupon Henry fled to Paris, where he was able to secure troops and equipment for an invasion, with the help of the French regent Anne of Beaujeu. And so, in August 1485, Henry sailed with a small contingent of French and Scottish troops, landing in southern Wales at Mill Bay near Dale, Pembrokeshire. He then marched with his army towards England. With him were his uncle Jasper and the Earl of Oxford, and because Wales was traditionally a Lancastrian stronghold, and Henry was directly descended from Welsh nobility, he was able to amass an army of around 5,000 soldiers, thanks to the loyalty inspired by his Welsh birth and ancestry. Henry planned to seize the throne by acting quickly to engage Richard, before he could call on his reinforcements in Nottingham and Leicester. And although they were outnumbered, Henry's Lancastrian forces defeated Richard's Yorkist army decisively at the Battle of Bosworth Field, near the Leicestershire town of Market Bosworth, on the 22nd of August 1485, where several of Richard's allies, such as the Earl of Northumberland and William and Thomas Stanley, either left the battlefield or switched sides. The decisive outcome was that King Richard was killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field by Henry Tudor, making him the last English king to die in battle. Henry's coronation then took place in Westminster Abbey on the 30th of October 1485, and after the coronation, Henry issued an edict stating that any gentleman who swore fealty to him would, quote, notwithstanding any previous attainder, be secure in his property and person. The following year, Henry then married Edward IV's daughter with Elizabeth Woodville, Elizabeth of York, on the 18th of January 1486 at Westminster Abbey, thus uniting the two rival houses. And so it was that Elizabeth Woodville played a crucial role in securing the ascension of Henry VII to the throne of England, an outcome which ended the Wars of the Roses and established the Tudor dynasty. And so Henry had honoured the pledge he had made in December 1483 to marry Elizabeth of York, who was also his third cousin, as both were great-great-grandchildren of John of Gaunt, who was in turn the son of Edward III. Once Henry VII had been crowned king, he returned Elizabeth Woodville to the status she should have held as the widow of an English king, by allocating her further lands to her dowry, including Farnham, as well as giving her an annual annuity. Elizabeth was also made godmother to Prince Arthur, the firstborn son of Henry and her daughter, Elizabeth of York. Through her daughter's marriage, Elizabeth Woodville would become the future grandmother of Henry VIII and the great-grandmother of Elizabeth I. Indeed, without Elizabeth Woodville, it is highly likely that Richard III would have maintained his place on the throne of England, and the Tudor dynasty would very likely never have existed. As king, on his marriage to Elizabeth of York, Henry VII had the titulus regius revoked and all found copies destroyed, and so Elizabeth Woodville was accorded the title and honours of a Queen Dowager, and her remaining children would once again be regarded as legitimate. And in so doing, Henry merged the rival heraldic symbols of the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York into the red and white Tudor rose, and so the houses of York and Lancaster would finally be united after over 30 years of continuous war, which had ripped the Kingdom of England apart. To secure his throne, Henry declared himself king by right of conquest retroactively from the 21st of August 1485, the day before Bosworth Field, to make anyone who had fought for Richard against him guilty of treason, and therefore Henry could legally confiscate any lands and property belonging to Richard III, whilst restoring his own. However, Henry spared Richard's nephew and designated heir, the Earl of Lincoln, and shortly after this, probably in November 1487, Henry VII gave Margaret Plantagenet, a Yorkist heiress, in marriage to his cousin, Sir Richard Pole, whose mother was half-sister of the king's mother, Margaret Beaufort. Richard Pole held a variety of offices in Henry VII's government, the highest being Chamberlain to Arthur, Prince of Wales, Henry's elder son. Henry had secured his crown by undermining the power of the nobility, as well as dividing them. He had married Elizabeth of York with the hope of uniting the Yorkist and Lancastrian sides of the Plantagenet dynasties, and he was largely successful. However, anyone with blood ties to the Plantagenets were suspected of coveting the throne, courtiers such as John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln. Indeed, whilst still in Leicester after the Battle of Bosworth Field, Henry was already taking precautions to prevent any rebellions against his reign. After leaving Leicester to go to London, Henry sent Robert Willoughby to arrest the 10-year-old Edward, Earl of Warwick, in Sheriff Hutton in Yorkshire, and take him to the Tower of London. This was because Edward was the son of George, Duke of Clarence, and as such he was the sole surviving male heir of the House of York, and so could present a threat as a potential rival to the new King Henry VII for the throne of England. Henry also made use of bonds of loyalty, and he also enacted laws against what was known as livery and maintenance, the great lord's practice of having large numbers of retainers who wore their lord's badge or uniform, and might provide a potential private army. But despite such precautions, Henry would face several rebellions over the next 12 years. The first was the rebellion of Viscount Lovell and the Stafford brothers of 1486, which dispersed without any significant fighting. But in 1487, Yorkists, led by John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, formed a rebellion in support of Lambert Simnel, a boy who was claimed to be the Earl of Warwick, the son of Edward IV's brother, George, Duke of Clarence, who had last been seen in the Tower as a prisoner. The rebellion started in Ireland, where the traditionally Yorkist nobility, headed by the powerful Gerald Fitzgerald, 8th Earl of Kildare, proclaimed Lambert Simnel to be king and provided troops for his invasion of England. But the rebellion was defeated and Lincoln was killed at the Battle of Stoke. However, Henry showed remarkable mercy, pardoning Kildare and the other Irish nobles, and he made Lambert Simnel a servant in his royal kitchen, where he was placed in charge of roasting meats on a spit. In 1490, a young pretender to the throne appeared in the form of a young Flemish boy from Antwerp, called Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, one of the princes in the Tower. Warbeck received the support of Edward IV's sister, Margaret of Burgundy, when he attempted to invade Ireland in 1491 and England in 1495, and when he persuaded James IV of Scotland to invade England in 1496. He also staged an invasion in 1497, when Warbeck landed in Cornwall, supported by a few thousand men, but he was soon captured and executed. During this time of turmoil for Henry, the Dowager Queen, Elizabeth, was at Bermondsey Abbey. She had retired there on the 12th of February 1487, and whilst some modern historians suggest that Henry VII forced her to retreat there from court, others present evidence from July 1486, which suggests that she had planned her retirement from court to live a religious, contemplative life at Bermondsey Abbey, whilst another theory suggests that she was forced to retreat to Bermondsey because she was involved in the Yorkist rebellion of Lambert Simnel of 1487, or alternatively, was seen as a potential ally of the rebels. Other sources suggest that Elizabeth Woodville was forced into retirement at Bermondsey Abbey on the suggestion of Margaret Beaufort, who was now known as My Lady the King's Mother. But this title was not quite so exalted as Dowager Queen of England, the title held by Elizabeth Woodville. Perhaps for Margaret, having to continue to defer to this woman, whom she had previously served, and who continued to outrank her, despite Margaret's own position as the mother of the king, was more than she could bear. However, at Bermondsey Abbey, Elizabeth lived a regal life and was treated with the respect due to a Dowager Queen. She lived on a pension of £400 and would receive gifts from Henry VII. She was allowed to be present at the birth of her granddaughter Margaret, when her daughter gave birth at Westminster Palace in November 1489, and she was also present at the birth of her grandson, the future Henry VIII, in June 1491 at Greenwich Palace, and her daughter Queen Elizabeth would also visit her on occasion, although another of her daughters, Cecily of York, visited her more often. Whilst at Bermondsey in 1491, Elizabeth would become the co-heiress of her brother, Richard Woodville, 3rd Earl Rivers, who had inherited his brother Antony's estates and title upon his death at the hands of Richard. And Henry VII briefly considered wedding his mother-in-law to King James III of Scotland, when James III lost his wife Margaret of Denmark in 1486. However, James III died in battle on the 11th of June 1488, when the king faced an army raised by disaffected nobles near Stirling at the Battle of Soccewburn. And so, Elizabeth Woodville lived out her remaining days at Bermondsey Abbey, and died there on the 8th of June 1492. Her daughters attended the funeral at Windsor Castle: Anne of York, who was the future wife of Thomas Howard, Catherine of York, the future Countess of Devon, and Bridget of York, who was a nun at Dartford Priory. However, Elizabeth, the Queen, did not attend, as she was awaiting the birth of her fourth child, and her other daughter, Cecily of York, was also absent. Her body was conveyed to Windsor by water, and her son Lord Dorset paid for the funeral. The surviving accounts of her funeral, on the 12th of June 1492, suggest that she was denied an appropriate ceremony, as some felt, quote, "Clearly, a queen's funeral should have been more splendid," and another chronicler stated that, quote, "Henry VII had not seen fit to arrange a more queenly funeral for his mother-in-law," although it was probably the case that simplicity was the Queen Dowager's own wish, as Elizabeth's will had specified she should be given a simple ceremony. A letter was discovered in 2019, which had been written in 1511 by Andrea Badoa, the Venetian ambassador in London, which suggests that Elizabeth Woodville had died of the plague. This could explain the haste and lack of public ceremony. However, this is only speculation. Elizabeth was laid to rest in a simple grave, at her own request, alongside her husband, King Edward IV, in St George's Chapel at Windsor, where they lie today, permanently united in death as they were in life. During her life, Elizabeth Woodville engaged in acts of Christian piety, as would be expected of a medieval queen consort. Her acts included obtaining a papal indulgence for those who knelt and said the Angelus, a devotion commemorating the incarnation of Christ 3 times per day. She also founded the Chapel of St Erasmus in Westminster Abbey and made many pilgrimages. Elizabeth Woodville was renowned enough to appear in 2 of Shakespeare's plays, Henry VI Part 3, which was written by 1592, in which she is only a fairly minor character, and Richard III, written in approximately 1592, where she plays a key role. Shakespeare portrays Elizabeth as an alluring woman, proud and noble in Henry VI Part 3, but by Richard III, she is portrayed as more tired and careworn from having to defend herself against enemies in the court, including her brother-in-law and adversary Richard. She is seen as a clever opponent for Richard, as she sees him for what he is from the beginning, but she is also portrayed as melodramatic and self-pitying. And although most modern editions of Henry VI Part 3 and Richard III call her Queen Elizabeth, the original Shakespearean script called her either Lady Grey or simply Queen, never actually referring to her by name. Elizabeth Woodville was an important figure in British history, and every tactful move Elizabeth made affected the outcome of the dynastic wars. She was a pivotal person, but one who is often overlooked, which is unjust for a woman who lived to see the Tudor line secured before her death, through the rule of 2 of her descendants, in the process ending the disastrous Wars of the Roses. Elizabeth and Edward had 10 children, with their youngest arriving only 3 years before the king's death. She had to witness the death of several of her children, the greatest loss for any parent, as only 5 daughters reached adulthood from the 7 girls and 3 boys, the others falling victim to illness or disappearing after being imprisoned inside the Tower of London, as was the fate of the 2 elder boys, Edward V and his younger brother Richard. The family unit that Elizabeth helped to create was a close, warm royal family, which retained qualities of loyalty and mutual support throughout Edward's reign and afterwards. Their household accounts and eyewitness testimony capture the investment of all of them in the life they had created together. Similarly, their eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York, continued to help her sisters and their offspring long after she had married Henry VII and become queen, following in the footsteps of her mother. Edward and Elizabeth were married for almost 19 years, but might have hoped for many more years together. Their partnership appeared harmonious and was an enduring one, with Edward adopting a tough style of leadership, ruling with his larger-than-life personality, and Elizabeth taking the typically feminine role of the supportive and fertile but essentially non-political queen. Their marriage could have been placed under considerable pressure by Edward's conflicts with his nobility, as jealousy and resentment at the newfound wealth of the Woodvilles created rivalries at court. But there is no evidence that suggests any particular conflict between the couple, or any lessening of affection, and none of the gossip and intrigue that surrounds the wives of Henry VIII, or those of Henry VI, Richard III and Henry VII exists within the marriage of Edward and Elizabeth. Edward refused to use marriage as a diplomatic tool and instead prioritised love. Elizabeth Woodville was an unlikely queen, being 5 years older than her royal husband, and her legendary beauty and flowing blonde tresses entranced the king to the extent that he married her against the advice of his council and ignoring tradition. Elizabeth was considered an unacceptable choice for an English queen, despite her considerable charms, by most of Edward's advisers. She was already a mother and a widow, born and married into Lancastrian families, the daughter of a lowly knight, a man whom Edward had formerly held in contempt. She brought no personal dowry or could promise no international connections. She held no territories or promise of diplomatic support. However, she did hold one great advantage, which was her fertility, bearing the king 10 children, as well as 2 sons to her first husband. Throughout the Wars of the Roses, behind the scenes, Elizabeth Woodville was there, pulling strings to keep her children from harm and deliver them to greatness. But with every turn, she faced betrayal and danger as England's White Queen. What do you think of Elizabeth Woodville, the White Queen? Did she betray the Yorkist cause by bringing about Richard III's downfall? Or was she one of the most remarkable and powerful women in English history who used her intelligence, as well as her beauty, to win one king's heart and destroy another, thereby uniting the houses of York and Lancaster, and so founding the Tudor dynasty? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.